Welcome to Microcollege, a podcast exploring innovative, place-based, and humanly scaled responses to the crises in higher education, meaning, and discourse in our time. Everyone knows that colleges and universities are at a breaking point, but what can be done? I'm Jacob Hunt, the director of Thoreau College, a microcollege in Viroqua, Wisconsin. Join us each week as we tackle this question head-on. Welcome to Microcollege. This week on the podcast, we are really excited to have here in the studio at WDRT in Viroqua, Brenna Cussen Anglada and Eric Anglada. Welcome.
Thank you.
We've got a lot of different things to talk about today, but that includes the Catholic Worker Movement and the Associated Agronomic University, the organization Nuns and Nones, and just different models of building intentional community on the land and building a meaningful life around that. We'll get into all those things, but we like to begin here on the podcast with people's biographies and their stories, especially associated with their young adulthood. Eric, maybe you could take it away first. Where were you, 18 to 20 years old, setting out on your journey of life?
So I'm originally from a suburb of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Grew up in a basically secular, non-political, upper middle class white family. And when I was 18, I got the idea of taking a year off between high school and my first year of college. My grandfather had recently died and left me $3,000, and I thought this could pay a lot of Greyhound miles for me to see the country. I had become a Christian actually when I was 18 years old, and saw myself very much as a seeker, as an explorer, as a kind of pilgrim of sorts. And I knew that what I grew up with was not the life that I wanted to lead. And so I wanted to do a bunch of volunteer work, get out and see the world and help folks out. And so I spent about 7 months on the road, traveling mostly by Greyhound bus, spending a few weeks at a variety of places. And I was actually staying in a homeless shelter in Phoenix, Arizona. And someone there, a volunteer, said, "Oh, if you're wanting to check things out, you should go and check out the Catholic Worker Movement." I was like, okay, I've never heard of that. And so looked it up and cold called Solidarity House in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And they said, "Sure, come on over. We'd love to have you." And it was a community run by two Franciscan monks who had fallen in love with each other and dropped out of the monastery and started a Catholic worker. We're hosting a handful of otherwise homeless men. They were picketing regularly at the Capitol around issues of trade unions and the death penalty. They served rice and beans for the neighborhood every single night. And so I just became totally intrigued with this Catholic worker movement that has over 200 communities across the world, but mostly in the U.S. and mostly in urban areas. And I remember a Catholic worker from Toronto, Canada, was visiting also at the same time. And he was talking to me and he said, "Why are you even thinking about going to college? Drop out, join the Catholic Worker Movement, join the revolution, man." So that was 18, 19 years old. I did go off to college. I went to 3 different colleges in 3 years before finally taking that advice of that Toronto Catholic worker and dropping out and really beginning my education at that point.
Beautiful. That's a great story. What about you, Brenna?
Yeah, it's hard to beat Eric's story, but also similarly getting radicalized by the Catholic worker around that time. I grew up in Massachusetts in a pretty Catholic family. My dad was a son of Irish immigrants. So working class on the way up to upper middle class white family, and went to college in Worcester, Massachusetts for a math degree. I was really good at math, and I thought a woman in math, like I can make a lot of money. Great. And then got to college and started meeting friends who were taking interesting classes on peace studies and nonviolence, and through those classes met Claire and Scott Schaefer Duffy from the St. Francis and Therese Catholic Worker they introduced me to anarchism. Also, there was the Agogo Anarchist Collective in Worcester who taught me what anarchism was, and as soon as I heard about it, I was like, yes, that makes all the sense in the world. I'm in. How do I sign up to be an anarchist? And also, Scott and Claire, with their 4 children, just lived in a small house and took in 5 or 6 folks at a time who had nowhere else to go. And when I would ask them about why they're doing what they're doing and why they had very little money, they always tied it back to the Gospels, of which I had been listening to for every Sunday for my entire life. And it came alive for me. I was like, oh, this is what I have been hearing in the gospel stories at Mass every Sunday of what Jesus told us to do. And this is the first time I've met people taking that seriously. And Scott and Claire had both participated in a lot of civil disobedience. They had both been to jail. They had both gone to different countries who were struggling with war and violent conflict, and they worked with people of those countries who were fighting oppression using nonviolent means. And they were both pacifists. And again, when I asked them more questions about why that was, they tied it immediately back to the Gospels, again, which I had recognized from my 18 to 20 years of Sunday Mass. And I thought, this is it. This is what I want to do with the rest of my life. I still graduated with a math degree, but I haven't used it.
Amazing. Yeah, I'm really excited to be able to have a chance to talk about Catholic Worker and in particular the educational components of this. This is, just personally is associated almost emotionally with me with the story of Thoreau College as well. So we've named ourselves after Henry David Thoreau, who's famously civil disobedient but also a sort of a loner, right? He famously went and lived the life of a hermit, and he was deeply engaged with his community, and there's lots of ways that we're inspired by his story. But I also, in the origin story for me of this project, I really was sensing in young people that I was working with, high school students, a real desire for community and for authentic kind of service and action in the world that in fact I didn't quite have a name for. I'd heard about Dorothy Day and Catholic Worker, but didn't really have any visceral sense of it, and kind of went asking around, asking of the world and of Google and things like that, and really came back strongly with this is an example of it in the world. And so it's somewhere in the DNA of Thoreau College. And we ended up, through the Youth Initiative High School here, forming a relationship with the Sukasa Catholic Worker House in the south side of Chicago, which now is a place that the 11th grade class goes to visit every year and engage with, work in the city and with that community. And it's just, this is a powerful, beautiful model of community and service and authentic kind of engagement with the world. So maybe you could step back and tell us a bit of the history of the Catholic Worker movement. What's a Catholic Worker House? And then we can move on from the distinctive ways that you're working with this idea.
Sure. So the Catholic Worker movement was started in 1933 by Peter Morin, who was a French peasant intellectual activist, and Dorothy Day, who is an American Catholic raised in Chicago, New York, and San Francisco, who was a Catholic convert looking for ways to put her spirituality into the world. And Peter Morin had this vision for a movement of communities. They began by doing a paper called The Catholic Worker, started May 1st, 1933, at a penny a copy, still being put out today. So it began as a paper, and then people began showing up. People began asking for food, for soup, for coffee, and so they began offering hospitality. This was at the height of the Depression, 1930s, New York. Immense amount of poverty and unemployment, so they began putting people up, began making hot soup. And they also harbored a vision, particularly Peter Morin did, of having communities going back to the land. And so historically, the Catholic Worker Farms have been the distinct minority within a broader, more urban movement. Though every once in a while we'll meet someone who says, wow, there are Catholic worker houses of hospitality in the city. I just know that there are farms. And that's very rare. Usually there is this association with soup kitchens, houses of hospitality, people living in simplicity with their guests. So over the decades, we'll be turning 90 as a movement next year. And Peter Morin said the Catholic worker is not an organization. We are an organism. So every community takes on a different shape. But the fundamental philosophy and goal, and fairly bold, is to build a new society within the shell of the old, which they borrowed from the Wobblies, the industrial workers, to build a new society within the shell of the old and create an alternative, create a society where it's easier to be good. And so it's just fascinating to see that the diversity of the movement. Brenna and I have visited probably a few dozen communities over the years, and you can kind of feel there's a feeling in each different Catholic worker, even as they might have different expressions within their locality.
Anything to add to that, Brenna?
I think you covered it well. The history of the Catholic worker.
Yeah. I would say, advice that I give to my high school students when they are graduating and thinking about what to do is you travel around the country, travel around the world. If you're looking for an interesting community of people, look for the Waldorf schools and look for the Catholic worker houses or Catholic worker farms, and you will be connected with the most interesting people in any community.
For sure, yeah. And we actually just recently had there's kind of a cross-pollination, a sense of a network amongst the Catholic worker movement, and just had a wonderful visit for a few days from a Catholic worker all the way over in Amsterdam. Uh-huh. And he was talking about their work, and he did a PowerPoint slideshow for us on the European Catholic worker, which we've never seen, but it's like, yeah, there are people doing this all over the world in different ways, and it's just so exciting.
Yeah, maybe I will add most Catholic worker houses, we're an anarchist movement, so there's no one thing you have to be or have to believe or have to take on, but a big common thread is our deep skepticism of capitalism and trying to live alternative models to that when we can, and then a deep skepticism of militarism, U.S. foreign policy, the power of the state, especially the violence that the state wields, particularly the nation state of the United States, and a deep love for hospitality. So whatever form that takes, whether that's like feeding lots of people who are hungry or whether it's just having an extra room to have for travelers and folks and strangers coming through. Those are some common threads you're going to find at a Catholic worker.
And when Brenna uses the word anarchism, we should probably clarify that we're not, of course, talking about lurking in the back alley with a bomb, but talking about the political philosophy that's been centered around voluntary cooperation, mutual aid, decentralization, organizing from below. And Dorothy Day was a lifelong anarchist, and so not only are we anarchists in political philosophy, but we're anarchists in our organization in the sense that we are decentralized. As Brenna said, there's no one saying you are or are not a Catholic worker.
Yeah. I think one of the fun things about Catholic workers, by saying the word Catholic and the word anarchist worker, you can freak out two wholly separate groups of people sometimes.
Yes.
Yeah, so you could say we either can relate to everybody or everybody is afraid of us.
We can alienate.
We can alienate everybody also.
Yes, a lot of provocative terminology here.
You pointed a little bit to this, Brenna, but could you talk about in the day-to-day life of your community, or maybe you can't generalize about this, but the relationship between the Catholic worker and the rest of Catholicism? Oh,
sure. There's no formal relationship. So our community, St. Isidore Catholic Worker Farm, the 4 adults who are permanent members there, long-term members there, we all happen to be Catholic, and we relate to like our local Catholic parishes, but that's somewhat uncommon in the Catholic worker movement. There are people there are definitely Catholics. There are a lot of ex-Catholics. There's other forms of Christianity represented. There's people of other faiths, and people have no real definitive faith. There's even definitive atheists in the movement, but people are attracted to the way of life, of offering hospitality, living simply, living in community, living closer to the land. Even a lot of city houses, it's hard to find a city house that doesn't have at least a little backyard garden, trying to grow some of what they eat. So a lot of people are attracted to the way of life, if not the spirituality. But the Catholic Church, there's maybe a love-hate relationship. Each community will decide how closely they relate, and sometimes local priests and bishops make that easier or harder, depending on the diocese and where you are. Dorothy Day, though, the co-founder of the Catholic Worker, is up for canonization. She received a unanimous vote by the United States bishops that her case should be investigated by the Vatican as a servant. So she's now, I think, a servant of God, and they're going to see if she can do any miracles up there for us down here. And if so, she'll be on her way to sainthood.
Microcollege is recorded in the broadcast studios of WDRT Viroqua 91.9 FM Driftless Community Radio on Main Street in Viroqua, Wisconsin. Thanks to Jim and all the folks at WDRT for the support of Thoreau College and the Microcollege podcast.
So you mentioned the St. Isidore Catholic Worker Farm, and so this is where you live. You're the founders of it, or co-founders. And so tell us about St. Isidore.
So St. Isidore Catholic Worker Farm, we are in the southwest corner of Wisconsin, down a little bit south of Platteville, just a few miles across the bridge from Dubuque, Iowa. We have been there since the spring of 2016. Before that, all four of us were at New Hope Catholic Worker Farm, just south of Dubuque. So have been living together for a number of years now. And we are on 25 acres of land. We have gardens, a small herd of cows, flock of chickens, bees, and we have solar panels and composting toilets, and try to practice, I think a fundamental part of what we're trying to do there on the land is to heal our relationship with the land. We also host lots of different folks who are interested in what you were talking earlier about, this hunger for community, for something more authentic. I'm thinking we just had a few days ago 35 students from all over the state of Iowa as part of an interfaith conference, and just engaging different peoples around what we're doing. And we're also doing some educational work as well. We're offering workshops on the basis of the gift economy, and we can go into the agronomic university piece, but Brenna, do you want to add anything about the farm?
Sure. Did you mention daily prayer together? So we, as a community, the four adults and whoever else is staying with us at the time, we pray 5 days a week in the morning for a half hour. It generally takes the form of a reading of the day, and then quiet time where we can all be quiet and contemplative together. And once a week, that prayer takes the form of reconciliation. So we together, just the four of us, will share any apologies or bring up any conflicts or needs that need to be addressed that we haven't been able to address otherwise. So I'd say that's at the heart of what we do. And then a number of years ago, definitely due in large part to the resistance out at Standing Rock on the Standing Rock Reservation. The Lakota Standing Rock Nation standing up against the Dakota Access Pipeline coming through or just north of their territory and traveling under the Mississippi. We started more seriously looking at our co-founder's principal, Peter Moore, and really saw like the Catholic Worker as a back to the land movement, and we really needed to start asking the question in a stronger way than we had been before, like back to whose land, because Peter Moore, like a lot of European immigrants and settlers of this country, just took it as a given that we could just take it and use it for our own spiritual growth and our own deepening our own connection and our own physical health and all the beautiful things that come along with a beautiful connection to the land. But it's not it's not ours. And it came to be ours through a long history of violence and oppression. And so for the last, I'd say, 7 or 8 years, we've been trying to look more deeply at that history and what that means in terms of our responsibility as white folks living on land that is traditionally Ho-Chunk and Meskwaki and Sauk and other nations who've lived there.
And so what form has that taken? I know you've done some workshops or teachings around this, and what else have you done?
Well, so at first, it really started just with a lot of education, which is of ourselves. It's not just the information of how the land, especially where we live, came to be in white hands is not like readily available. So there's a lot of deep digging and research that I and really especially Eric have been looking into, and then sharing that communally. Yeah, so we hold workshops. We've had 2 different week-long and then another weekend-long workshops at our farm around decolonization and like helping each other learn what is the history of our own land, and then what is our personal history of immigration and our own ancestry coming to this land, and how did we benefit from the violence that took place on this land through colonization, and then trying to stand in solidarity with Native folks who are resisting further encroachment and destruction of their land, such as the resistance against Line 3 up in northern Minnesota, which was largely Ojibwe women-led resistance. So standing in solidarity with them, sometimes even at the risk of arrest and jail, and trying to take on some of that risk with these folks. It's taken on like having Native speakers, reading a lot of Native authors, and then Eric does a lot of book discussions on Native authors, and then I have been working particularly the last couple of years with fellow Catholics, looking at what our role is in for truth and accountability of the fact that we ran a lot of boarding schools in the United States. We ran at the very least 80, and it's probably more like a couple hundred. We're trying to even research and learn that history so that the church can take on responsibility. But some of the first steps for taking on responsibility is finding out what even happened, and that's not even readily available all the time. Eric, would you add to that?
Well, I just wanted to note that in 2019, February 2019, Brenna and 3 others broke into an Enbridge facility and shut down a pipeline, and faced for a time a felony, the felony was ultimately dropped and you did 2 days in jail. But so trying to put our bodies on the line a little bit more. I like to talk about the first fall that we moved to the land, a day where Peter and Mary Kay, with whom we live, were installing solar panels. I was preparing a retreat on ecology and spirituality, and Brenna was standing in front of a bulldozer in central Iowa trying to defend land against the Dakota Access Pipeline. So that's kind of a microcosm of what we're trying to do in prayer, spirituality, regeneration, sustainability, resistance, activism. Just even a few weeks ago, we had a very powerful gathering up in Sheboygan, where we were invited to help in their resistance to a world-class golf course being proposed on native sacred land, as well as like really important ecosystem right on Lake Michigan. And so we co-led with our friend Michigan, who's a Potawatomi Miami elder, kind of a gathering of prayer. We call it a sacred land gathering. So all of these different forms, all of which are super small in the face of the huge colonial beast. But these are the ways that we're trying to engage that and to heal ourselves, heal the land, and heal some of these relationships.
Yeah, it's striking. The process, what you said, begins with education, right? With education of yourself, and then you can see it flows out into education of your community and other people of the world in general. And sometimes that's education by action, right? As well as teaching classes and discussing books and things like that.
Yeah, they were educating that jury. I mean, for 4 days, it was amazing. Those jurors had never heard of this world of sustainable agriculture and sacred land and activism. I mean, it was really beautiful.
Yeah, so can we step back a couple steps? And so this term agronomic university, I think certain quotient of people will have heard of Catholic worker houses, a smaller quotient will have heard of Catholic worker farms, and then a few people will have heard of agronomic universities. But my understanding is this is an essential part of Peter Moran's vision.
It's certainly in my view, yes. Yeah, as I have lived into the Catholic worker movement after I dropped out of college, I moved to St. Jude Catholic Worker in Champaign, Illinois, where we're providing hospitality for otherwise homeless women and children, had a soup kitchen, also engaging in roundtable discussions, which is an integral part of Peter Moran and Dorothy Day's vision of clarifying thought and reading books and talking and he said there's no revolution without a theory of revolution, which a line he borrowed from Lenin. And so part of Peter Moran's vision of the Catholic worker movement and engaging the land are what he called agronomic universities, where the worker and scholar can come together and really honor the full human being, body, mind, and spirit. And so Peter Moran was always searching for the perfect schedule to allow for the perfect integration of body, mind, and spirit. And so in those early days of the Catholic worker farm movement, the farms emerged a few years after they emerged in 1936, 3 years into the movement's history. And his idea was very much rooted in the history of monasticism. And as we talk about the Catholic Church, which for so many people is right in line with authoritarian and oppression. But Peter Moran and Dorothy Day always saw the Catholic tradition, or at least certain parts of it, as being liberatory, and that they really kind of lifted up this 2,000-year-old radical tradition that's been with part of Catholicism. Some of his heroes were the early Benedictines, who were creating communities on the land where learning and manual labor were very much honored. He talked about a green revolution, which is confusing now because of Norman Borlaug and which the contemporary, emphasis on chemicals and industrial agriculture and all that stuff, which is the exact opposite of what Peter Moran talked about with the Green Revolution. But when he talked about the Green Revolution, he said this is in contrast to the Red Revolution. Our Green Revolution is rooted in the Irish early medieval monastics and villagers who lived on the land and engaged in what he liked to call cult, culture, and cultivation. Cult in that ancient sense of reverence, worship, prayer. Culture in the sense of learning, books, scholarship, and cultivation, where engaging the land. And so Peter Moran felt like we were living through another Dark Ages, where as the Irish monks were furiously copying down manuscripts and trying to save this remnant of culture as the Roman Empire was crumbling. He felt like this is the time we are living in. And so we need to be honoring the full person. We need to create these communities on the land where there is learning happening, where there is sharing of skills, where there is prayer, meditation, reverence. So our little experiment is a nod to that. Historically, the Catholic worker has been, as I said earlier, very much more urban than rural. And there were a few initial experiments in the early 1940s at the Catholic worker farms on doing something kind of modeled on a folk school, where people would come and spend weeks together and folk dancing, as well as prayer, as well as working in the fields, as well as listening to lectures and reading books. And so I just thought that was just such an enticing adventure. And so what we've done is very, very small scale. But we've now done maybe 9 or 10 different of these week-long, we call them growing roots, where we split the day in half. Half the day is in presentation, reading, and discussion. The other half is in shared labor on the land together. We begin the morning with prayer, meditation, often end the evening around the bonfire singing. And so, and this year we had our first foray into a little bit of a longer experience where we offered what we called the Peter Morin program. For 4 weeks, we had four folks join us where we got a lot done in the gardens, and we had intentional discussions around racial justice, Catholic worker movement, et cetera. And so we're, it's all a small scale educational experiment, really, but just honoring the fact that we are these human beings who have intellectual needs, spiritual needs, physical needs, and trying to honor the full dynamism of the human person.
And what can you characterize the kinds of people who are participating in these the week long and then the longer workshop you did this spring?
Oftentimes, through people are finding finding out about us through the Catholic worker movement in some way. It was I kind of assumed that we would have mostly folks right out of college come. That was one person who was a recent college grad. Another person in their late 20s on the search, looking for meaningful life. Another person in their 40s came, who now owns land in Indiana, really wanting to kind of like get some ideas for how to engage their land. And then a woman in her 50s who is an activist from Madison. So it was a great diversity. And then folks who come for our week-long Growing Roots tend to be Catholic workers or people in that mold who kind of run in that scene a little bit. But there's
a lot of whom live in city Catholic worker houses and want to dive deeper into like the philosophy or theology or political discussions behind the Catholic worker, and also just want a week out on the land. And it's a real treat for folks who live in cities to be able to come out to the farm and get their hands in the dirt.
Folks who come with skills who are offering their skills. So we've had yoga instructors, we've had massage therapists, singers, artists, poets. Everyone's kind of offering their own skills. And so it is a very organic affair.
So again, this is the St. Isidore Catholic Worker Farm, Cuba City, Wisconsin. If people are curious about it, how would they find out more about this?
They could Google that name and they will not find a website, but they'd probably find our email and phone number, and it's a landline, so they could call us if people have texted us and then have been surprised when we can't text them back, or email catholicworkerschool@gmail.com, and we're pretty good about
Catholic Worker School. Yeah, I would say anyone who also can get onto your mailing list. You could receive the wonderful zine you produce.
Right.
Yes, we do an annual zine. A part of the Catholic worker tradition has always been the journalism and the paper and the writing. And so each winter we focus on putting out a 26-page zine, and we have our book recommendations and different essays about what we're thinking about. And so if you want to receive that, you can email us at catholicworkerschool@gmail.com.
Thoreau College is a leader in an emergent movement dedicated to the renewal and revitalization of higher education through the creation of new, humanly scaled institutions with holistic curricula known as microcolleges. Thoreau College, higher education for the whole human being.
Another thing we wanted to talk about, something, Brenna, that you've been involved with, is this fascinating initiative, Nuns and Nones. And this is N-U-N-S and N-O-N-E-S.
Yes.
This came up a few weeks ago when we interviewed John Vervaeke, and it's another kind of another step in this exploration of monasticism and organized or intentional, I should say, life sharing and life based around meaning. So can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Sure. So Nuns and Nones, N-U-N-S being like Catholic sisters, and N-O-N-E-S being like spiritually rooted but not necessarily religiously affiliated seekers and activists, many of whom happen to be millennials, but not necessarily. it began about 5 years ago as conversations between these two groups of people. The younger millennials, I'll just call them the millennials to not get it too confused, were wanting a life, spiritual rootedness to their activism, and saw that Catholic sisters had been living for decades, rooted in community, rooted in a way of life, like a rule of life, and it had been working for the most part, and that they were very much social justice minded and involved in a lot of social justice movements. So these conversations started happening and kind of caught like wildfire around the country. So they were happening in lots of different places. So the organization formed around it to support those meetups happening. And I was not involved at the beginning, so I'm kind of sharing the stories that I've heard. There were some experiments with some of them moving in together to see how this might take root. And then, as we all know, a few years ago, a pandemic happened. And so a lot of the in-person cross-pollination was a lot harder to happen. So some of those experiments in actually living in community with one another and stopped or didn't take root the way they were hoping. And instead, what is taking root right now is a shared, I guess you could call it ministry, or a shared program together. So a year ago, formed the Land Justice Project, and that is what Eric worked for a little bit and still does sporadic some work for as well. And then I'm working more permanently with the Land Justice Project. So it's a shared between these two groups, the Nuns and the Nones, realizing that given the state of the climate and given the state of racial injustice due to 500 years of colonization on this continent, what steps could we take as a group together toward both racial and ecological healing? And a lot of Catholic sisters in this country own a lot of land. They have access to, they are the title holders to a lot of land, to a lot of beautiful land and property. And due to racial injustice in this country, it's also true that 98% of private land in the United States is owned by white people. And it's very difficult because of systemic racism and because of the price of land. It's very difficult for a lot of movements led by people of color, particularly Black and Indigenous folks, who are creatively figuring out ways to mitigate or to fight against climate change because of their great experiments in trying to sink carbon into the ground with regenerative agriculture or restoring native habitat, restoring prairie. It's hard for them to have access to land because the price of land is so high, and because of land has been stolen from Indigenous folks by white people. Wealth and labor has been stolen and land has been stolen from Black folks by white people. So this Land Justice Project is seeking to bring these two groups of folks together: Catholic sisters who have land, and young or movements led by people of color who don't have land but have the vision and the skills to heal land. And we're trying to work with Catholic sisters to see what might be possible. How can we transfer the title away from more white-owned land to these movements? So that's what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. Big project.
Huge. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's the whole concept of Nuns and Nones is, it seems like when I learned about it from you and have researched a bit more, and there is a website for Nuns and Nones, by the way.
Yes, very much an online presence.
So we'll link to that.
It's
in the show
millennial
notes.
run, so yeah. It's social media all over.
I mean, it's a sense of, I've grown up in, pretty locally here in Wisconsin, Catholic family. My father went to one-room schoolhouse taught by Franciscan sisters, and so I've been aware of the decline of that part of the community, right? It's very aging, and there used to be this whole part of the local scene that's really there anymore. And so it seems natural in some way that there's something emerging into that space in some way. I think that it's fascinating the way that it's been framed.
Yeah, Catholic sisters, for a lot of communities we're working with, their median age is in the 80s. So they're already doing property planning. They're already imagining like how can we pass on this land in a way that reflects our values? And for so many of them, again, due to systemic racism and white privilege, a lot of the options that they see available to them are like conservation easements, which I think are great things. I think they're great. They're great tools. Again, a lot of them are run by white organizations, and because our worlds are so segregated, there haven't been like lots of natural places for relationships to be formed with movements led by people of color, and so we're trying to bridge that gap. And I think sisters want to do something racial justice, like aligned with racial justice, aligned with climate justice, or aligned with ecological justice. And we're helping them to fill in those dots.
And just wanted to quickly mention one neat experiment where this is happening on some level out in Long Island, New York, is the Sisters of St. Joseph have been partnering with the Shinnecock Nation right there. They have a tiny reservation right next to the Hamptons. Huh. And there's this bizarre dynamic where the Hamptons, there's these billionaires, but there's not like really like septic. So they're often just all their waste is going right into the ocean there and polluting the waters. And so the Shinnecock, these 6 Shinnecock women have approached the sisters about creating a collective around kelp farming. And kelp farming sequesters carbon, cleans the water, and they're able to sell it as a product. And so that's just a neat collaboration. We don't know where that's going to go exactly, but that kind of gives you a little bit of a sense for like the possibilities with, there's 45,000 sisters across the United States. I don't know how many thousands of acres, but there are possibilities out there. And sisters are really, like so many of us in this time of reckoning, have George Floyd and Standing Rock, and I've read Isabel Wilkerson's book Caste, and are like, how really can we, act on the side of justice and liberation here? So it's a fascinating project that we don't know where it's going to go, but the time seems ripe for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just overall, Catholic worker houses, farms, this idea of bringing together, sisters and young people. I think it speaks to this some of the deep needs of our time, right? Spiritual connection, outside of maybe some of the dogmatic structures that have characterized that in the past, but also community and also just structures of time. I'm wondering if you could go back to, or you mentioned that Peter Morin was always trying to find the ideal schedule, right. and that really resonates with me as a person working on the college here.
Yes.
And I don't know if you could talk a little bit more about how that looks in your place. You've mentioned daily prayer and reconciliation, but say a bit more about that. What is a harmonious and what's a sort of a healthful schedule for a community doing the kind of things you are doing?
Sure, we can say what our schedule is, and it's been healthy for us. But I think it's going to depend on the community and who's living in it and how they're living their lives. But the 2 adults that we live with have 2 children. So our schedules necessarily have to take into account the children's schedules, and so we wake up, do morning chores, which involves milking cows, feeding chickens, and then the kids go off to school, and during the school year, and then we pray from 8:30 to 9. We generally have communal work for those of us who are home. We each have part-time employment, so. For those of us who are home on the farm and not working off the farm, we usually our work is loosely from like 9 to noon. Then we have lunch and rest, and then work again from 2 to 5. That's sort of our rhythm of the day, and then eat at 6. And we hold to that structure, but it's a very loose structure. It's a very flexible structure that can be shifted depending on what people's needs are. But it's nice to fall back on that structure, and then. That's like a daily rhythm, but it's been lovely learning, having grown up in more of a suburb type setting, moving out to on a farm, really learning how to live into the seasons. So just the other day, I think today's Monday, so just on Friday, the temperature dropped from a balmy 70 degrees in November to like 30. And it was perfect timing. We had just finished getting the garden beds ready for winter, and then it's like on Friday we went inside and we lit up the stoves, and it's like cozy time. It's time to plan gardens for next year. It's time to read by the fire and get some more work on the computer done. It's an inside time. It's a very different time than the very active growing season, which is generally about April to like Thanksgiving for us.
Yeah, and it was that change in the weather was right on schedule because it was Martinmas, the feast of Saint Martin, which is a day that is celebrated in the Waldorf schools, but it has a deep cultural tradition. The way the Waldorf schools celebrate it is with a lantern walk. The kids make lanterns, and here in Viroqua they go out to Sadi Hollow, which is the little lake here by town, and other places they go walk around the neighborhood, kind of like a light surrounded inversion of Halloween a little bit, kind of going around the neighborhood.
Cool.
That has deep European roots, but also Martinmas is the day associated with slaughter, with animal the kind of harvest of the animals. And so at Thoreau College, we slaughtered one of our sheep, and been kind of processing that.
Wow.
And that's also traditional. And the weather was just perfect because it went from quite warm to cold, so you could let the animal hang for a couple of days.
That's very neat. Yeah, that's something that we have been continually trying to lean more and more into over the past number of years. And our community's name, St. Isidore, his patron saint of farmers, his feast day is May 15th, which is the last frost date in our area. So we always have a prayer and celebration and potluck to kind of mark the beginning of the season, the growing season, and that's really morphed into us. We've become linked in with this Wild Church network, if you've heard of that, where communities across the continent, communities across the continent over the past decade or so, just independent of one another, have taken to prayer and ritual and community building outdoors. And we were doing that, and we had a spring equinox gathering at Sinsinawa Mound a few years ago, and someone came and said, well, do you know the Wild Church Network? I said, no, I don't. And so later connected with them, and now we're doing public gatherings at Sinsinawa Mound and other places around the Dubuque area and parks. And there's a real hunger for folks. We're connecting the natural rhythms of the year with the liturgical church year. And just in the way you're talking about with Martin, it's wonderful. Yeah, those connections are really powerful. And that's just another way, I think, of resistance to sort of like flat time, with like time divorced from the land. And so that's just been a meaningful
time that like the capitalist society wants us to recognize, like Valentine's Day is time to buy everybody cards, or Labor Day, the way the U.S. government says it should be instead, where celebrating. For example, the Feast of St. Bridget is on February 1st, and also that's Candlemas and the Feast of the Presentation of Jesus to the Temple. But that's also but that's also Imolc, and it's the kind of the Celtic spring, and it's when things start warming up a little bit and things start thawing out a little bit, and or like the Feast of St. John the Baptist lines up pretty well with Summer solstice. Both associated with fire and the decreasing of light. John the Baptist said, I must decrease so that he might increase. And it's getting prepared for 6 months later when Jesus is born at Christmas or winter solstice. The correlations are beautiful.
Another day that's important, especially in the Waldorf schools, is Michaelmas, which has a deep kind of an academic history, actually, also in Oxford and Cambridge, the kind of the British university school system. Michaelmas was opening day of the school year, basically. It was the Michaelmas
September
term.
29th?
Right, so right
Yes,
around
yeah.
the fall, the autumnal equinox.
Yes.
And
Yes.
in the Waldorf School is celebrated as a festival of courage, right? As kind of getting ready. It's still warm, but you know what's coming, right? Winter is coming, and the darkness is coming, and so a lot of that. Definitely, I think is thinking about the academic year, thinking about the kind of the agricultural year, right? There's just a lot of rich practical and cultural and community building life to be built around that, and that we really have thought of the curriculum as being built around the seasons. The seasonal changes here in Wisconsin can be so dramatic.
Yes.
They're an inner journey of their own as well as an outer journey.
Yes. Well, thanks for sharing. I didn't realize about the Martin. And Nicole.
Martin of Tours is one of my favorite saints. Now I'm definitely gonna start celebrating it the way you're talking about. But Martin of Tours was also the first. I think he's the first conscientious objector in Christian history. When he became Christian, he told his officer, he was a soldier, and he told them, I can no longer carry a weapon. I cannot fight because now I'm a soldier of Christ. And he offered to go to the front lines, but without carrying a weapon. He refused to kill anybody else, and for that he was imprisoned. So he's kind of a patron saint of folks who conscientiously object to the military. So he's one of my favorites for that reason.
Yeah. Great stories and great figures are important too. Wonderful. Well, we're coming up towards the end of our hour here. And I guess I just want to thank you both so much for your time here. You drove up to Viroqua, and I'm really excited to be able to share all the things you're doing with our audience.
We're really honored for the invitation. It's always a delight to come up to Viroqua. It's kind of a haven for us, so we really appreciate it, and really grateful for your work with Microcollege and all of the alternative education. I know you've been at this for a number of years, and so it's just such important work, and this cultural renewal stuff. So I'm grateful for the invitation as well as for your work.
Yeah, ditto. We were just telling a friend this morning about where we were coming, and she has a 9-year-old son. She's like, "What? I'm going to send my son there for college." So anyway, you got another student on his way.
Early admission. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Too.
Bye.